Hey everybody, Steven here, and different video. This is really a test for this, but I'm going to be benchmarking my new RTX 3070 against my GTX 1080 Ti. So I have the Zotac RTX 3070 and then the Aorus GTX 1080 Ti. The 1080 Ti has been a great card. I've had it for 3.5 years. It is a very snug fit in my NZXT H1 case here though, and I'm wanting to use RTX voice with the streaming that I potentially would be doing on my second rig. This is really the second rig in the house here, but you can see that this is a very snug fit. And with the Zotac 3070, it's not only a slim card compared to this, but it's also just much smaller. Now, people report thermal issues with the NZXT H1 case here. Mine under load with the GTX 1080 Ti is usually about 80 when I'm kind of pushing a game for a long period of time. So I really haven't had huge issues with it, but I know with the 3070 here, it should even bring that down. But as you can see, the GTX 1080 Ti here with its 11 gigabytes of DDR5 is a beefy card compared to the 3070 here, which has 8 gigs of DDR6. And as you can see here, what you young kids would say is this looks thick because yes, that card is much thicker with that 1080 Ti than that 3070. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a snug fit in the case. So I'm excited about just the smaller form factor that I actually get with the 3070. Setup was quick and easy, literally just uninstalled the 1080 Ti. Went ahead and installed the 3070. Everything was seamless, no issues there. And so what we're going to talk about today is benchmarks in Cinebench, and we'll look at the graphs with that. And then this will be for 1440p as the comparison. I'll also be checking out Red Dead Redemption 2 and then Horizon Zero Dawn. I wanted to do a bunch of other games, but I figured this was a good starting point to actually test all of this. Now, I bought this card off of eBay, so not super proud of buying it off of that because of the huge markups, but with those huge markups, I'm able to sell my 1080 Ti for a much higher price than I could if everything was at its normal price point, so it's kind of a trade-off with this. And in terms of why I did this at 1440p, it's what I personally play in terms of the resolution. And I think a lot of people are really playing at 1440p more so than 1080p or 4K. It kind of seems like the good middle ground. And like I said, I wanted this to be the good starting point. Now, of course, if you're going to do 4K, you're going to lose a lot of FPS. And then if you go to 1080p, you're going to gain a lot of FPS. But I am going to play this in the 21:9 aspect ratio, so 3440 by 1440p, and the 16:9 aspect ratio, which is that 2560 by 1440p. So let's go ahead and get into the 3D Mark tests. All right, so for 3D Mark, I have two different tests with two different resolutions here. So we have Time Spy at 3440 and 1440p, and then we have Firestrike at 3440 and 1440p. I didn't do the ray tracing test, obviously, because the GTX 1080 Ti doesn't do that. So let's look at the top here. So with the 3440 Time Spy test, we have with the 1080 Ti a score of 9300, and then compared to the RTX 3070, we have 12,224, which is a 31% increase in the score between those two. Next, we have 1440p for Time Spy. So with 1440p here, the 1080 Ti has a score of 9446, very close to its first score there. And then the RTX 3070 has a score of 12,293, same thing, very close. So very close score between the 21:9 aspect ratio and the 16:9 aspect ratio with that. The difference there was an increase of about 30%. Next, we have Firestrike. So Firestrike for 3440. With the 1080 Ti, we have 23,019. And then for the RTX 3070, we have 25,775, which is an increase of 12%. Next, we have 1440p for Firestrike. This is interesting because the score went down when I went to a lower resolution in aspect ratio, but the 1080 Ti has a score of 22,639, while the RTX 3070 has a score of 25,221. The difference here is an increase of 11% with the 3070 leading over the 1080 Ti. So next, let's look at the FPS with these tests. So this is 3D Mark 1440p with Time Spy and Firestrike. So starting with Time Spy, and these have two different, you see GT1 and GT2 here. So this is the two different tests that it does within the main test. And so for this with GT1 here, the 1080 Ti had 60.78 FPS, while the 3070 had 85.67 FPS. That's an increase of almost 25 FPS. It's 24.89 frames per second. Next, we have the GT2 test. The 1080 Ti had 55.78 frames per second, while the 3070 had 74.47 frames per second, with the 3070 having an increase in 18.69 frames per second. Next, we have the Firestrike GT1 test. The 1080 Ti had 130.56 frames per second, while the RTX 3070 had 154.71 frames per second, which is an increase of 24.15 frames per second. And then lastly, we have the Firestrike GT2, and the 1080 Ti had 107.87 frames per second, while the RTX 3070 had 129.48 frames per second, which is an increase of 21.61 frames per second. Next, let's look at 3440. All right, so for Time Spy GT1, the 1080 Ti had 59.43 frames per second, while the RTX 3070 had 84.88 frames per second, which is an increase of 25.45 frames per second. GT2 for Time Spy, the 1080 Ti had 54.28 frames per second, while the RTX 3070 had 73.99 frames per second, which is an increase of 19.71 frames per second. Next, we have Firestrike GT1. The 1080 Ti had 129.98 frames per second, while the RTX 3070 had 154.46 frames per second, which is an increase of 24.48 frames per second. And then lastly, we have Firestrike GT2. The 1080 Ti had 107.39 frames per second, while the RTX 3070 had 129.17 frames per second, which is an increase of 21.78 frames per second. Next, let's get into the Red Dead Redemption tests. All right, so full disclosure, I am going to be working on how I do these in terms of the layout of the bar graphs here. Still need to tinker around with this. This was one particular layout, and then Horizon Zero Dawn will have a different one. But you can look at the legend there, and you can see which ones are the 1440p min, max, average, and then the 3440 min, max, average. So let's go ahead and start with the 1440p minimum, because between these and the 3440, the mins on both are almost negligible. They're so close to it being the same number, it's practically the same. After that, we have the max. So for 1440p max, the 1080 Ti had 71.1 frames per second, and then the RTX 3070 had 96.7, which is an increase of 25.6 frames per second, or an increase of 36% overall frames per second over the 1080 Ti. Next, we have 1440p and the average. So the GTX 1080 Ti had 52.6 frames per second for the average, while the RTX 3070 had 71.1, which is an increase of 22.5 frames per second, or roughly a 43% increase in FPS. Next, looking at the max FPS, so for 3440 here, the 1080 Ti had 59.9 FPS, while the 3070 had 85.5, which is an increase of 25.6 FPS, or 43% increase over the 1080 Ti. Next, we have the average FPS. For the 1080 Ti, it was 45.6, while the 3070 had 64.4, which is an increase of 18.8 FPS, or an overall increase of 41% over the 1080 Ti. Next, let's look at Horizon Zero Dawn. So switching up the layout of the bar graph here, so it's going max, average, min, so going 1440p down to 3440. So with this, for the 1080 Ti, we had a max of 126 FPS, while the 3070 had 149 FPS, which is an increase of 23 frames per second, or an 18% increase overall. Next, we have the average. So for the 1080 Ti, we have 71 frames per second, and the 3070 has 90 frames per second, which is an increase of 19 frames, or a 27% increase. Next, we have the minimum, and I don't know what was going on with the 1080 Ti. I ran the test multiple times, and it would still fluctuate between 7 to 10, maybe up to 12 FPS, and it would always do that for the minimum. So the 1080 Ti has 10 FPS for the minimum, while the RTX 3070 has a 50 FPS minimum here, which is a 400% increase over the 1080 Ti. Next, we have the maximum for the 3440 aspect ratio. So the 1080 Ti had 99 FPS for the max, and then the 3070 had 133 FPS for the max, which is a 34 FPS increase, or 34% increase over the 1080 Ti. Next, we have the average FPS. So for the 1080 Ti, it had 59 FPS, while the 3070 had 77, which is an 18 FPS increase, or 31%. And then lastly, we have the minimum. And so for some reason, it actually did better for the minimum in 3440 with the 1080 Ti than the 3070. So it was 40 for the 1080 Ti and 34 for the 3070, which is a decrease of 6 FPS, or roughly a 15% decrease in performance with that. Next, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about thermals for just a quick second. All right, so while running both of the tests within Red Dead Redemption and Horizon Zero Dawn with the GTX 1080 Ti, it seemed to average 76 to 78 degrees. While playing games for longer than 20 minutes, it would always peak at 80 degrees and then it would hold there. For the 3070, while actually running these tests, it held 73 to 74, so it actually decreased by about 2 to 4 degrees. While playing games for longer periods, that longer than 20 minutes, it typically stays around 76 to 78 degrees. So same thing, about a 2 to 4 degree difference where we're seeing that decrease with the RTX 3070, which is really cool to see because it's a smaller form factor GPU with greater performance. Now the card I had, like I said, it's 3.5 years old, and of course we're always going to be making progress, but I was actually pleasantly surprised with the decrease in thermals with my H1 case while still getting that huge increase in performance. Now, this was just a test video, so I want to hear from you guys. There's a lot of stuff I got to work on because I actually want to run my 1080 Ti against my 3080 that's coming in. So hopefully I can spend a little bit more time with that, do a little bit more with benchmarking. It is very hard to do where I watch people and they're actually just playing a game and they're showing you and they're doing this repetitive thing. When they record that, if they mess up and it goes to a pause screen and their FPS shoots through the roof, that whole recording is scrapped. So there's a lot that goes into this stuff that I wasn't actually expecting. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section about this first attempt, things that I could work on with this to make it a little bit better. I know the bar graphs definitely need to improve, but I want to thank you guys so much for watching. What do you think about the performance difference between the 3070 and the 1080 Ti as well? So that's going to be it for this one, everybody. If you like the video, hit the like button for me. If you want to continue to follow along with all my content, hit the subscribe button for me. Thanks so much for watching.